Good morning. This morning, we are going to read a very important essay by a great poet, T.S. Eliot, entitled The Metaphysical Poet. Okay, page 123. By collecting these poems from the work of a generation more often named than read and more often read than profitably studied, Professor Grierson, we have already read Grierson's essay. His essay is also a very important essay. Professor Grierson has rendered a service of some importance. Certainly the reader will meet with many poems already preserved in other anthologies, at the same time that he discovers poems such as those of Aurelian Townsend, or Lord Herbert of Cherbury, here included. But the function of such an anthology as this is neither that of Professor Saintbury's admirable edition of Caroline Poyse, nor that of Oxford Book of English Verse. Mr. Grierson's book is in itself a piece of criticism and the provocation of criticism. And we think that he was right in including so many poems of Donne. What does it mean? Right? If you include one poem by a poet, what does it mean? This poet is not that important. If you include hundreds of poems, the most important. And if you go through any anthology of English poetry, you'll see the long list of Yeats's poetry, longer than the poem by T.S. Eliot, right? So, we think that T was right in including so many poems of Donne elsewhere, though not in many editions accessible, as documents in the case of metaphysical poetry. The phrase has long done duty as a term of abuse or as the label of a quaint and pleasant taste. The question is, to what extent the so-called metaphysicals form the school, in our own time, we should say a movement, and how far the so-called school or movement is a digression from the main current. Not only is it extremely difficult to define metaphysical poetry, but difficult to decide what poets practice it and which of their verses. The poetry of Donne, to whom Marvell and Bishop King are sometimes nearer than any of the other authors, is late Elizabethan, is feeling often very close to that of Chapman. The courtly poetry is a derivative from Johnson, who borrowed liberally from the Latin. It expires in the next century with the sentiment and witticism of Prior. There is finally the devotional verse of Herbert, Vaughan, and Crashaw, echoed long after by Christina Rossetti and Francis Thompson. Crashaw, sometimes more profound and less sectarian than the others, has a quality which returns through the Elizabethan period to the early Italians. It is difficult to find any precise use of metaphor, simile, or other conceit which is common to all the poets, and at the same time important enough as an element of style to isolate these poets as a group. Donne and often Coley employs a device which is sometimes considered characteristically metaphysical. The elaboration contrasted with the condensation of a figure of speech to the furthest stage to which ingenuity can carry it. Thus, Coley develops the commonplace comparison of the world to a chessboard through long stanzas, for example, to Destiny, and Donne with more grace in a valediction. We read this poem, right? We have already read this poem. A valediction, the comparison of two lovers to a pair of compasses. But elsewhere, we find, instead of the mere explication of the content of comparison, the development by rapid association of thought, which requires considerable agility on the part of the reader. On a round bowl, a workman that hath copies by can lay on Europe, Africa, and Asia, and quickly make that which was nothing all. So doth each tear, which these doth wear, a globe, world, by that the impression grow, till their tears mixed with mine do flow, this world, by waters sent from thee, my heaven dissolved so. Here we find at least two connections, which are not implicit in the first figure, but are forced upon it by the poet. From the geographer's globe to the tear, and the tear to the deluge. On the other hand, some of Donne's most successful and characteristic effects are secured by brief words and sudden contrasts. For example, a bracelet of bright hair about the bone, where the most powerful effect is produced by the sudden contrast of association of bright hair and of bone. This telescoping of images and multiplied associations is characteristic of the phrase of some of the dramatists of the period, which Donne knew, but not to mention Shakespeare. It is frequent in Middleton, Webster, Toner, and is one of the sources of the vitality of their language. Johnson, Dr. Johnson, who employed the term metaphysical poet, apparently having done Cleveland, Coley, chiefly mine, remarks of them that the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Right? Metaphysical poetry, right? This is characteristic. The force of this impeachment lies in the failure of the conjunction, the fact that often the ideas are yoked but not united. And if we are judged of styles of poetry by their abuse, enough examples may be found in equivalent to justify Johnson's condemnation. But a degree of heterogeneity of the material compelled into unity by the operation of the poet's mind is omnipresent in poetry. We did not select for illustration such a line as Notre âme est en trois mains, chacun son Ikari. We may find it in some of the best lines of Johnson himself, the vanity of human wishes. His fate was destined to a barren strand, a pretty fortress, and dubious hand. He left a name at which the world grew pale, to point a moral or a dawn of tale, where the effect is due to a contrast of ideas different in degree, but the same in principle as that which Johnson mildly reprehended. And in one of the finest poems of the age, a poem which couldn't have been written in any other age, the Exequy of Bishop King, the extended comparison is used with perfect success. The idea and the simile become one in the passage in which the bishop illustrates his impatience to see his dead wife under the figure of a journey. Stay for me there, I will not fail to meet thee in that hollow vale, and think not much of my delay. I am already on the way, and follow thee with all the speed desire can make, or sorrows breed. Each minute is a short degree, and every hour a step toward thee. At night when I betake to rest, next morn I raise nearer my west of life, at almost by 8 hours sail. Then when sleep breatheth this dowry gale, but hark, my purse like a soft drum bids my approach, tells thee I come, and slow however my marches be, I shall at last sit down by thee. A very beautiful poem, missing its wife, right? In the last few lines, there is that effect of terror which is several times attained by one of Bishop King's admirers, Edgar Poe. Again, we may justly take these quatrains, 4 lines, from Lord Herbert's ode, stanzas which would, we think, be immediately pronounced to be of the metaphysical school. Another poem. So when from hence we shall be gone, and be no more, nor you nor I, as one another's mystery, each shall be both, yet both but one. This said, in her uplifted face, her eyes, which did that beauty crown, were like two stars, that having fallen down, look up again to find their place. While such a moveless silent peace these seas on their becalmed sands, one would have thought some inference their ravished space did possess. There is nothing in these lines, with the possible exception of the stars, a simile not at once grasped, but lovely and justified, which fits Johnson's general observations on the metaphysical poets in his essay on Coley. A good deal resides in the richness of association, which is at the same time borrowed from and given to the world becalmed. But the meaning is clear, the language simple and elegant. It is to be observed that the language of these poets is, as a rule, simple and pure. In the verse of George Herbert, this simplicity is carried as far as it can go, a simplicity emulated without success by numerous modern poets. The structure of the sentence, on the other hand, is sometimes far from simple, but this is not a vice. It is a fidelity to thought and feeling. For example, John Donne's poem. The effect at its best is far less artificial than that of an ode by Gray, Thomas Gray. And as their fidelity induces variety of thought and feeling, so it induces variety of music. We doubt whether in the 18th century could be found two poems in nominally the same meter as so similar in Marvel's Coy Mistress and Crescio's Saint Teresa. The one producing an effect of great speed by the use of short syllables, and the other an ecclesiastical solemnity by the use of long ones. Love, thou art absolute lord of life and death. If so shrewd and sensitive, though so limited, a critic as Johnson failed to define the metaphysical poetry of his faults, it is worthwhile to inquire whether we may not have more success by adopting the opposite method, by assuming that the poets of the 17th century up to the Revolution were the direct and normal development of the preceding age, and without prejudicing their case by the adjective metaphysical, consider whether their virtue was not something permanently valuable, which subsequently disappeared, but ought not to have disappeared. Johnson has it, perhaps by accident, on one of these peculiarities when he observed that their attempts were always analytic. He would not agree that after the dissociation, they put the material together again in a new unity. It is certain that the dramatic verse of the later Elizabethan and early Jacobean poets expresses a degree of development sensibility which is not found in any of the prose, good as it often is. If we accept Marlowe, a man of prodigious talent and intelligence, these dramatists were, directly or indirectly, it is at least a tenable theory, affected by Montaigne. Even if we accept also Johnson and Chapman, these two were notably erudite and were notably men who incorporated their erudition into their sensibility. Their mode of feeling was directly and freshly altered by their reading and thought. In Chapman, especially, there is a direct sensuous apprehension of thought, or a recreation of thought into feeling, which is directly, exactly what we find in Donne. Okay, this is Donne's point. In this one thing, all the discipline of manners and of manhood is contained. A man to join himself with the universe in its main sway and make in all things fit one with that all and go on round as it is, not plucking from the whole his wretched part and into straits or into naught revert, wishing the complete universe might be subject to such a rag of it as he, but to consider greater necessity. We compare this with some modern passage. No, when the fight begins within himself, a man's worth something, God stoops over his head. Satan looks up between his feet. Both tug. He is left himself. In the middle, the soul wakes and grows, prolong the battle through his life. It is perhaps somewhat less fair, though very tempting, as both poets are connected with the perpetuation of love by offspring, to compare with the stanza already quoted from Lord Herbert's Ode, the following from Tennyson. One would walk between his wife and child, with measured footfall firm and mild. And now and then he gravely smiled. The prudent partner of his blood leaned on him, faithful, gentle, good, wearing the rose of womanhood, and in their double love secure, the little maiden waked demure, pacing with downward eyelids pure. These three made unity so sweet. My frozen heart began to beat, remembering its ancient heat. How do you feel? What's the feeling of this? The poem feels like what? Music, right? So Tennyson focused on the musicality in the poem, then the meaning. But this is beautiful. But compared with John Donne, it sounds shallow to me. How do you find it? I don't know. The difference is not a simple difference of degree between poets. It is something which had happened to the mind of England between the time of Donne or Lord Herbert of Cherbury and the time of Tennyson Browning. Of course, this is one of the reasons too. It is the difference between the intellectual poet and the reflective poet. Who is reflective? Tennyson. Who is intellectual poet? John Donne. Right? Who is intellectual and reflective poet? Daniel Albright. Both, right? Did you get the book and get a signature on it? Okay. The Tennyson Browning are poets, and they think, but they do not feel their thought as immediately as the odor of a rose. This is very important. Thought, right? You have to feel your thought immediately as the odor of a rose. So what does it mean? Feeling and thinking at the same time, right? A thought to Donne was an experience. Wonderful. A thought to Donne was an experience. It modified his sensibility. When a poet's mind is perfectly equipped for his work, it is constantly emulgating disparate experiences. The ordinary man's experience is chaotic, irregular, fragmentary. The latter falls in love, reads Spinoza, and these two experiences have nothing to do with each other or with the noise of the typewriter or smell of cooking. In the mind of the poet, these experiences are always forming new wholes. So now you can understand what T.S. Eliot was doing while he was writing poems, right? He is going to put feeling and thought together at the same time, simultaneously, right? We may express the difference by the following theory. The poets of the 17th century, the successors of the dramatists of the 16th, possessed a mechanism of sensibility which could devour any kind of experience. They are simple, artificial, difficult, or fantastic as their predecessors were, no less nor more than Dante, Guido Cavalcanti, Guinicelli, or Cino. In the 17th century, a dissociation sensibility set in, from which we have never recovered. And this dissociation, as is natural, was aggravated, made bad by the influence of the two most powerful poets of the century, Milton and Dryden. Each of these men performed certain poetic functions so magnificently well that the magnitude of the fact concealed the absence of others. The language went on and in some respects improved. The best verse by Collins, Gray, Johnson, and even Goldsmith satisfies some of our fastidious demands, better than that of Donne or Marvell or King. But while the language became more refined, the feeling became more crude. Wonderful. Good observation. Right? Good observation. The feeling, the sensibility expressed in the country churchyard, to say nothing of Tennyson Browning, is cruder than that in the coy mistress. This is the judgment, opinion of T.S. Eliot, right? Country churchyard. This is a beautiful poem. You'll see. We are going to read it. The second effect of the influence of Milton and Dryden followed from the first and was therefore slow in manifestation. The sentimental age began early in the 18th century and continued. The poets revolted against the ratiocinative, the descriptive. They thought and felt by fits and unbalanced. They reflected. In 2 or 3 passages of Shelley's Triumph of Life, in the second Hyperion, there are traces of a struggle toward unification of sensibility, but Keats and Shelley died, and Tennyson, Browning ruminated. After this brief exposition of a theory, too brief also to carry conviction, we may ask, what would have been the fate of the metaphysical had the current of the poetry descended in a direct line from them, as it descended in a direct line to them? They did not certainly be classified as metaphysical. The possible interests of a poet are unlimited. The more intelligent he is, the better. The more intelligent he is, the more likely that he will have interest. Our only condition is that he turn them into poetry and not merely meditate on them poetically. A political theory which has entered into poetry is established, for its truth and falsity in one sense is to matter, and its truth in another sense is proof. The poets in question have, like other poets, various faults, but they were at best engaged in the task of trying to find the verbal equivalent for states of mind and feeling. And this means both that they are more mature and that they were better than other poets of certainly not less literary ability. It is not a permanent necessity that poets should be interested in philosophy or in any other subject. We can only say that it appears likely that poets in our civilization, as it exists at present, must be difficult. Our civilization comprehends great variety and complexity, and this variety and complexity, playing upon a refined sensibility, must produce various and complex results. The poet must become more and more comprehensive and more elusive, more indirect, in order to force and dislocate, if necessary, language into its meaning. A brilliant and extreme statement of this view, with which it is not requisite to associate them, is that terve agent abstrait à la poésie aujourd'hui. Hence, we get something which looks very much like the conceit. We get, in fact, a method curiously similar to that metaphysical poet, similar also in its use of obscure words and of simple phrasing. Okay, French, I'll skip. After a second quote, okay, the same poet could write so simply, elle est bien loin, elle plaire le grand vent, sur le manque aussi. Jules Faulk and Tristan Colbière, in many of his poems, are nearer to the school of Donne than any modern English poet. But poets more classical than they have the same essential quality of transmuting ideas into sensations, of transforming an observation into a state of mind. Pour l'enfant amoureux de quelque distant univers égal à son vaste habité, que le monde est grand à la clarté, les langues OCW-HYU, du souvenir que le monde est petit. In French literature, the great master of the 17th century, Racine, and the great master of the 19th, Baudelaire, are in some ways more like each other than they are like anyone else. The greatest two masters of diction are also the greatest poet psychologists, the most curious explorers of the soul. It is interesting to speculate whether it isn't a misfortune that two of the greatest masters of diction in our language, Milton, Dryden, triumph with a dazzling disregard of soul. If we continued to produce Miltons and Drydens, it might not so much matter, did not so much matter, but as things are, it is a pity that English poetry has remained so incomplete. Those who object to the artificiality of Milton or Dryden sometimes tell us to look into our hearts and write, but that is not looking deep enough. Racine or Donne looked into a good deal more than the heart. One must look into the cerebral cortex, the nervous system, and the digestive tract. May we not conclude then that Donne, Croshaw, Vaughan, Herbert, Lord Herbert, Marvell, King, Coley, Edisbeth are in the direct current of English poetry, and that their faults should be reprimanded by the standard rather than coddled by antiquarian affection. They've been enough praised in terms which are implicit limitations because they are metaphysical, witty, quaint, or obscure, though at their best they have not these attributes more than other serious poets. On the other hand, we must not reject the criticism of Johnson, a dangerous person to disagree with, without having mastered it, without having assimilated the Johnsonian canons of taste. In reading the celebrated passage in this essay on Coley, we must remember that by wit he clearly means something more serious than we usually mean today. In his criticism of their versification, we must remember in what a narrow discipline he was trained, but also how well trained. We must remember Johnson tortures chiefly the chief offenders, Coley and Cleveland. It would be a fruitful work, and one requiring a substantial book, to break up the classification of Johnson, for there's been none since, and exhibit these poets in all their difference of kind and of degree, from the massive music of Donne to the quaint, pleasing tinkle of Aurelian Townsend, whose dialogue between a pilgrim and time is one of the few regretful omissions from the excellent anthology of Professor Grayson. Wonderful essay, right?